everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a full-on spoiler review for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Now you can check out my non-spoiler review of the movie within the channel, and also reviews of previous Mission Impossible movies within the franchise, and I'll leave some links within the description. So this won't be a chronological breakdown of the movie, but much more of a free-flowing discussion about the standout elements which worked well, and the ones that didn't work quite as well. So final warning now for spoilers within Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 in 3, 2, 1. Now the first thing I want to mention is probably the film's biggest issue, and that is the matter of overextension. And we saw this both in terms of the dialogue, scenes, and especially the action sequences. Now to be fair, I did like the first opening scenes where we see, I guess, what was the emergence of the Entity as it instigates an attack on a Russian submarine. This is very well staged in terms of suspense, and it was giving me clear vibes of the Hunt for Red October, and I think overall this was a good way to start the overall movie. And this was followed by the meeting of all the government officials, where we saw the return of Henry Simi as Eugene Kittredge, who was the IMF director, and we remember this from the original first film. And this was the first of the many Dutch angle shots that Christopher McQuarrie was using. We remember this technique from the first scene between Ethan Hunt and Kittredge from the 1996 first film, where we had all of those overhead panning shots between the two. And this is a technique that directors use to really just generate tension, where characters are given far more exposition during the dialogue scenes. And when we saw this moment, it was very obvious that the grey-haired man that walked into the room later on was clearly Ethan, wearing a mask, but it was still very good how they built up to that moment. And I just think overall, when the film was doing scenes like this, it did engage you to the overall story. But then we come on to the sequence at the Abu Dhabi airport, where whilst tracking the location of the key, Ethan meets Grace for the first time, and we see Benji discovering a nuclear bomb at the airport, and he has to solve various riddles in order to disarm it. And I did like this scene. It was very inventive and something different that we hadn't seen before within the Mission Impossible series, and proof again that you don't need to have explosions going off every 2 minutes in order to generate tension. And whilst it was very good, it did eventually overstay its welcome. After a while, we're like, okay, we get it. There's a nuclear bomb. They have to solve the riddles. Let's just get to the climactic act so we can move on to the next scene. And unfortunately, there was many moments like that throughout this movie. And I think the biggest example in terms of excess was the car chase in Rome. This is again what we saw in all of the trailers, where we see Ethan and Grace handcuffed together as they're trying to evade all of the various enemies. And again, when it first started, it was very good, but then it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And this sequence must have played out for a good 20 to 25 minutes, I'm sure. And eventually we get to that point again where we're like, can we just stop this now so we can get to the eventual story? This is an example of when the action and spectacle eventually becomes indifferent. You're no longer excited because it's just repeating the same beats as what's gone on before. And I think it reached this point when we see them getting into the yellow minicab. Now, they wanted to generate some humour, and yes, people in the cinema were laughing as Ethan and Grace were having to constantly switch positions and they were driving around in a yellow minicab. Just the excitement had just worn off for me at this stage. We had another example in a club scene in Venice, where we see all of the characters grouped together, discussing their intentions for the key. And again, this scene must have gone on for a good 3 to 5 minutes, where we had everybody trying to explain the state of the entity, what it's trying to do, who it's looking for, all of the implications. And it's like, we already established this in previous scenes before. We don't need another exposition dump as to what exactly the entity is. It then brings up the next issue in terms of Ethan not being killed by various characters. I was questioning this so often throughout this film. There are multiple opportunities when all of the assassins had multiple opportunities to just shoot him, but instead everybody was choosing to fight Ethan hand to hand. And again, these moments were staged very well, but I suppose it's the same issue as what we see a lot with the John Wick movies and also the James Bond films, where you want to have these characters in dangerous situations, but you take it to the point where if they really want to kill the lead character, they could just shoot him or stab him. But no, we have to create some sort of gymnastics that involved these villains doing silly things in order to help Ethan get out of situations. There was another case like this where we have a frantic chase in the streets of Venice, where the entity is giving Ethan false directions, and we reach this stage where he finds himself trapped in an alleyway between Paris and another assassin, and they clearly could just shoot him, or they could just stab him, but they choose to fight him one-on-one. And I think after a while, this diminished also the extent of the threat of Paris as an assassin. They were clearly trying to build her up as this dangerous femme fatale, and that's absolutely fine. But the level of threat is diminished if you have her easily beaten by the hero. And this resulted in this fight encounter here where Ethan spares Paris's life, and of course that would go on to pay dividends when we come to the end of the film. We then have to talk about the threats of the AI entity and the whole concept, how it was built up as the movie's main villain. And for me, it just didn't work as a choice of antagonist. Now yes, there is a certain intrigue as to what the entity is, and again, the scenes of the characters constantly in the unknown, asking questions about what it is and how they can locate it, it did create certain elements of suspense. But we established early on that the AI has already been able to control a lot of the world's networks and communications. So at this stage, the AI should be able to achieve its goal easily of obtaining the key, whether it can assimilate somebody else or easily shut down the IMF and all of their technology. And I just didn't get the whole idea of Gabriel being its entity or being under its control. How did that happen? Why just control Gabriel as its manifestation or its soldier? Why not control a whole group of assassins who can easily locate the key and take out anybody who gets in their way? Okay, I understand that it controlled Gabriel because at the time his identity has been completely wiped out. But why not control the government agents? Why not control the presidents or the government officials? Why not manipulate Ethan himself, as it sees Ethan as the main threat to what it's trying to do? All of these questions just established that the AI doesn't really work or hold up in terms of a concept. Now, of course, when it comes to part 2, I'm sure there'll be far more exposition and explanation as to what exactly the AI is. I'm pretty sure there'll be some hidden figure from a previous Mission Impossible movie who died perhaps and then was resuscitated to life by some technological device and is overall controlling the AI. That scenario might be far more convincing, but again, that's something that we could see in part 2, and really we needed some explanation within part 1. And I'm sure there was also a scene later on throughout the film where we saw Gabriel in some sort of resuscitation chamber as he was getting out amongst the train. Again, this doesn't really make any sense. Now yes, I do understand that there is always an outlandish nature within the Mission Impossible movies, but the fact is they are still far more grounded in reality than what we see within the superhero films. So if you're going to introduce a mysterious AI that's controlling everything and is able to control individuals, you really have to be much more sure the concept and the parameters that you'll set in order for us as viewers to believe that this is something of a real and substantial threat. And for me, the AI just didn't work at all, but perhaps it will be given greater context when we come to part 2. So we'll then talk about Rebecca Ferguson's Elsa Faust, who is easily the strongest female character of the entire franchise. But I can't help feeling that perhaps both the character and actress were a little underutilised and somewhat disrespected. Now, I did say when I saw the first trailer that it was likely that Elsa would die, as there were simply too many female characters for all of them to survive for both parts. And given the fact that part 1 and part 2 will be the overall conclusion to this franchise, you're always going to have that big character death to give some emotional weight and impact. And it really does feel that Elsa was just thrown in there for that particular purpose. If we really look at the story, she easily could have had Grace's role, and the story could have followed her and Ethan together on the run from all of the villains trying to get the key. As we all know, Elsa is a very skilled and competent fighter, so we wouldn't have had to go through all of the questions regarding how exactly Grace is able to show some fighting skills, even though we just regard her primarily as a professional thief. And if you wanted to have Elsa die, you could have had it happen at the very end. This would have given an even more bigger emotional climax and perhaps left some sort of cliffhanger to go into part 2. But it seems very much that Hayley Atwell was brought in to replace Rebecca. It can't be a coincidence that both actresses are brunette, British and of a similar build. Now maybe Rebecca Ferguson had come to the end of her contract and she didn't want to sign on for part 2. Maybe she had asked for a bigger salary for part 2, given the fact that she's far more prominent as she's been starring also in the Dune movies. Now if that's the case, you didn't need to put her in this film at all, and you could have just carried on with having Hayley Atwell as Grace from the start. But the fact that they've put her in this film, have her have a couple of scenes with Ethan and then just kill her off, again it just feels a bit disrespecting to the actress. And when we look at Ilsa's death scene, it was kind of preempted all the way through, from the fake out at the opening desert shootout to Gabriel's constant monologues when he was predicting that Ethan had to experience some huge loss. So it was very predictable that Elsa would come to her death. and it really didn't quite have the emotional impact that I think it should have done. But we then indeed talk about Ilsa's replacement, very much so, and that is the role of Grace, played by the stunning Hayley Atwell, and she was absolutely great in this film, and very much like Ilsa was in Rogue Nation, what made Grace such an interesting character is that she had this constant duplicitous nature. For the most part, in the beginning, she was very much out for herself, but she wasn't heartless or completely ruthless. She showed moments of compassion and also vulnerability. There were many times when she's clearly out of her depth, and this made her far more appealing. The fact that she wasn't 100% super competent Mary Sue, as what's often referred to, was very much refreshing. And I guess they didn't want to make Grace just another assassin or a special agent, because of course we had that previously with Ilsa. So there was a bit more variation this time around in terms of Grace when compared to Ilsa. And one of the best scenes of the character was when she had to play the White Widow, Alana, in order to meet with Kettridge in order to purchase the keys. And we see this time that she's very nervous and unsure as she's making a transaction. And this was really great acting from Vanessa Kirby, who completely convinced that she was actually Grace in the identity of Alana, as we see those tense moments when she's facing Kittredge. And overall, this is really an origin story for Grace, as this is how she gets recruited into IMF, which is fine, as long as they continue that vulnerability and development in part 2. It will lessen the character if, when we get to that movie, that she's already on the same skill level as Ilsa, as what we saw from Rogue Nation. It just won't be as consistent with the character. But once more, we will see what happens when we indeed get to the sequel next year. So we then move on to the movie's overall ending, and without question, it was the most thrilling and exciting part of the film, as we of course see Ethan's motorbike jump off the cliff. Such a tense moment that they really stayed in that moment as we see Ethan free falling down from the cliff. Absolutely fantastic cinematography. There was a slight disbelief in how exactly he comes just crashing through the window. It would have been far more believable if he had just landed on the roof and then just come down onto the train. Dropping down that fast at that velocity, he surely would have broken at least one of his legs, if not both. But here we see he's a bit disorientated and then just carries on. Now again, I understand that we do see a lot of outlandish nature within these Mission Impossible movies, but once more, because there is a certain reality, I think they could have had a bit more thought when playing out this overall sequence. But we then come on to the climatic fight between Ethan and Gabriel on the roof of the train. Again, absolutely fantastic, as they're constantly having to dodge all of the bridges and the lights, especially when they go under the tunnel. We have that tense moment when Ethan looks to stab Gabriel but pulls away at the last minute due to the agents on the train as well. Gabriel eventually escapes and sets the detonations for the bridge for the train to explode on. He thinks he's got away with the key, but Ethan eventually steals it back from him. Again, if somebody is being guided by this super intelligent AI, they shouldn't really be able to be manipulated like that. Again, this is another flaw within the concept. But we then get a truly gripping sequence of Ethan and Grace having to jump through each of the carriages as they're falling off a cliff. Absolutely fantastic to watch. Truly nail-biting stuff. And of course they ultimately survive, but as the agents catch up to them, there's only one parachute, so Ethan escapes with the key after Paris reveals the location of the entity, which is in the underwater submarine that we saw from the opening sequence. We see Grace eventually initiate her recruitment into the IMF, as he has to make the ultimate choice that they underline through halfway through the film. This is of course has a juxtaposition back to the choice that Ethan made at the beginning of the film, where we saw his backstory and how exactly he joined IMF. And then we get the narration at the end, all leading to the location of the submarine, and this of course will be the initial plot going ahead for part 2. And I still believe that the entity is being controlled by somebody from previous films connected to Ethan. They've already hinted at that within the first movie, and they will definitely go for much more of a emotional and personal weight for part 2, there's no doubt about that. Otherwise, why is the entity so connected to Ethan overall? I wouldn't put it past them to have maybe John Voight's character from the first film, who we assume met his death in that train sequence, maybe surviving barely and being resuscitated by some sort of technological device, being connected to the entity, and that's why he's so invested in Ethan. Surely there'll be far more depth into Ethan's backstory in part 2, as with the role of Gabriel and also the woman Maria who was killed in that backstory. It must surely all tie together, otherwise this movie will just mean nothing. And this is always the problem that you have when you're doing a part 1 and a part 2, because part 1 will always have some sort of level of incompleteness because it needs to rely completely on part 2. And I've always said that if a movie needs a further film in order to complete a storytelling, then that means that part 1 has some sort of failure. Then that means you failed in terms of storytelling if part 1 truly needs to be defined by part 2. But I do think overall that part 1 did about just enough to have a complete and a somewhat conclusive ending to the overall story. So that's it then in terms of my overall spoiler review for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As I mentioned before, you can check out my previous reviews of other Mission Impossible movies within the franchise, and I will leave some links within the description. And of course, I will shortly provide coverage of the opening box office of the movie and go over the numbers and determine as to whether it will be indeed the much touted saviour of the box office within 2023. So look out for all of that content within the channel. But if you have any other suggestions regarding any other movies, television series, or any other topics within the entertainment and pop culture scene that you'd like to see me cover, then also let me know within the comments and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves and I will see you very, very soon.